Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. Feel free to like or dislike the video as you see fit, so feel free to hit those buttons. Feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. The purpose of this channel is educational in regards to deconversion and atheist issues, particularly involves Bible theology and politics. So you're free to share my videos as much as you like because it is an educational channel. Today, actually, I'm celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the channel, and so I wanted to redo an earlier video that, while very popular, I go back and I look at it, and yeah, it definitely shows the signs of me really trying to get this channel off the ground. I hadn't had any subscribers yet, wondering who that was going to be. I now have 62 at last count, so the channel's grown quite a bit in a year, given the very niche aspects of it. So here I am about to redo my deconversion story, and I originally tried this once already, and the problem became that it got very long because I now have a lot more to say about it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do part one. I'm going to just talk, and when I hit about 20-25 minutes, I'm going to cut it off, and then I'm going to do part two, and we'll see how far that goes. But the original video that I did was like 35-40 minutes, and I'm like, yeah, that's a little bit too long for a single go. This is the first anniversary edition of my deconversion story. That's not the first anniversary of my deconversion. It's actually the first anniversary of this channel. So that's kind of what we're celebrating here. I've actually been deconverted from Christianity probably since 2014-15, somewhere in there, where I really, I made the decision that it was garbage, but then I kind of went the other direction a couple of times and wrestled with it, because that's the real trick with deconversion. When you look back at something and when it happened, you realize that you were struggling back and forth. So to start off my deconversion story, I need to give a little bit of my background. I was raised in a Christian home, in an Assemblies of God Pentecostal home. My parents actually were very good people. I have no good regrets. In fact, my dad factors into my deconversion a lot because it's probably why I delayed it so long. And I'll get to that when I talk about my time in seminary. But my parents were good people. They raised me really well. I was an only child, so I didn't really have need of anything per se, but we weren't exactly rich. And my parents, I think, because of the more notable mystique about, oh, you're going to spoil an only kid, did try to make me work for a lot of things. So my early life was dotted with small jobs. Even as a youngster, I had a paper route, through hay in the summer, things like that. So had a good childhood, a good raising, no regrets. I don't really feel like I was abused by my Christian parents per se. I did learn a lot of things in Sunday school, which is probably some of my earliest memories are actually from Sunday school, oddly enough, particularly beginner class. But in that Sunday school, they focused more on the whole, quote unquote, whole gospel, and probably more the Pentecostal experience of being filled with the Spirit. So the doctrine of hell was there, but it wasn't really, and I did hear a few fire and brimstone preachers over the years growing up, but I don't think that that had any aspect in me converting. The real thing about converting to Christianity as a child is that you don't really remember a specific time when it happened. You went to the altar so many times out of guilt that you just, probably the only thing I can say about it is there's a twofold thing that keeps you motivated to keep your faith at this point. Number one, the guilt, of being a sinner. So you got to keep, repenting. And the other part is, the real good, you've learned the Bible a lot early on. Now, the real problem with that is if you're really a studious person like me, you learn the Bible and realize there's a lot of problems. But when I was growing up, I just figured I didn't have enough education to know the answers. I went through teen Bible quiz. I went through, the youth group, was active in both of those, had a great time. That's where I met my first future wife, was in church. So at the time, I was, it was what we were and who we are. As far as deconversion goes and indoctrination goes, you need to realize that 90%, 90 to 95% of indoctrination happens with a smile and a hug. It's not, fear and all this other stuff. It's just the constant, this is the truth, this is the truth, this is the truth, when there's no verification. So that's kind of the way it went. Through a bunch of circumstances at the altar, I felt a call into the ministry. I ended up having one false start with that, going to another school. But then I eventually married my wife. And one of the first things we did after that summer was pack up our stuff, head to Trinity Bible College in Ellendale, North Dakota, where I spent the next 4 years studying a degree in biblical studies and ministry. Although I didn't start that way, it was biblical studies and missions minor, but then I switched over to ministry and began studiously looking at being a pastor. I would say if there's any aspect of my Bible college education that led to my deconversion, it was the fact that I took Greek class and I learned about textual variants and I learned about different things. And every Bible class, I would studiously read the Bible and notice problems. But, the Bible's inspired, so it must be me, not the Bible. So after 4 years of Bible college, I ended up really feeling like a lot of my questions weren't answered. And seminary becomes a really weird place for me because, I wanted to go on. I wanted to get a mastery in theological studies, which I did. But a few things happened there that kind of planted the seeds both directions. One, why I waited so long to deconvert, but also some of the reasons why I deconverted. At Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky, they're not as conservative. They're certainly not as Pentecostal. And so I ended up learning a lot of things that I had my Bible college had kind of crucial, they kind of just skimmed the surface. But in seminary, we dived pretty deep. And, I learned about the critical theories and, the lower criticism of textual criticism, the higher criticism of the very higher critics that were, going at the Bible as a whole. And I discovered that the Bible had an incredible amount of flaws. And if a personal event hadn't happened at that time, I probably would have deconverted, except I now have a shit ton of time invested into this. Okay, so at that point, you're kind of deep. And so, a lot of the seeds of some of the things I talk about on this channel were formed there. Okay, so this is, this is kind of where some of the seeds of my doubt were planted, because the more I studied the Bible much deeper and much more with a focus, the more I realized how much flaws are in it. That doesn't jibe well with the Assemblies of God, definition of inspiration, which is, the Bible's the verbally inspired word of God, that the words and thoughts were inspired directly by God. Now, they have no proof of this, but that's what they believe. So I had my doubts, but in the middle of all that, my father died. Now, my father was a very devout Christian. My parents had put into my head, don't worry too much about death because, we'll all see each other again, making the assumption that we're all going to make it to heaven. And so I was conflicted because my mind was saying, yeah, there's a lot of bullshit in the Bible. But my heart was saying, I really hope it's true because I want to see Dad again, because my dad was a great guy and losing him was very traumatic. I can kind of look back at that moment as kind of where a lot of my depression begins. And I think if I look at it from a deconversion standpoint, the seeds of doubt are pulling you on one side saying, this isn't really real. You shouldn't be wasting your time with this. And on the flip side, your personal side, I want to see Dad again in heaven, become kind of conflictatory. And that's got to do a number on your mind. Okay, it really does. And your heart and your emotions. And, I was still a very strong believer. The doubts weren't that big, but they started to grow over the years. After my father's death, I did graduate from seminary. It took me a little bit longer because I went really into a deep depression kind of thing, which I did come out of eventually, thanks to help by just getting active and doing things that I needed to do. But it took a couple of years, and during that time, I failed to get licensed and ordained. I failed to get a lot of things until a friend of mine came along, took over our church, because I settled back into my hometown. And one of the things he did is he got me back into the ministry. I became director of Christian education at my home church. And then later on, I was the Christian education pastor. It was during this time I probably had the most success I ever had in ministry. I watched my Sunday school grow that I was in charge of from 35 to 85. I started a Bible Institute where I started to present the Bible myself with me and the pastors and chief instructors. One of the classes I taught, which had been my favorite class in Bible college, looking back on it, but one of the classes I taught, and now I had the seminary critical thinking going on with it, is that it was life of Christ. And as I began to study the life of Christ, I began to realize there were some massive problems that maybe my whole thought was, I just don't know about history. I just don't know about archaeology to answer a lot of these problems. So on the side, I would be studying some of this stuff. I went through the life of Christ in that Bible Institute fully once, and I started it a second time, and more doubts came in about the authenticity of whether Jesus Christ was even a person. But now I'm pretty deep into the ministry as a career. I'm also, how can I say this, invested quite a bit with time, energy, and money. And, I'm trying to make a career out of it, which at the time, one of the things that caused me to go into the ministry full time and be my own pastor was, after doing all this work of, building a Sunday school to 2.5 times what it was, to, helping that pastor get a church from, 45 to 120 where we're meeting on 2 services. It's the most successful time I ever had in the ministry as far as church growth. I went to him, and I'm working overnights at Walmart at that time, 40 hours a week. And then I'm also spending 30 hours a week at the church. And what I wanted to do was go part-time at Walmart and be a little bit something at the church and get paid for it so that I could offset that. And the board of my church, who I'd grown up with, turned it down. And so I put my resume together, polished it up, and, went out in the ministry and ended up with my first church. And I pastored because my friend had helped me get my license, and I pastored my first church, got ordained. That didn't go well. I was a rookie pastor, made a lot of mistakes from a practical side. But also I struggled with my depression during my ministry a lot. It's not that it's just there are some days it gets bad. I just don't want to deal with human beings. I can do my job. I can preach every Sunday. I can, do all the administrative work. I can come into the office, do all that stuff. But I became painfully aware that unlike many of my other ministry brethren that took 2 hours, 6 hours to do a sermon, I could sit down, open up a passage, write out an outline in 5 minutes, and be ready to preach it in a half hour. It was a skill that saved my butt a couple of times, because I would walk into a situation, the guest speaker is gone. Can you fill in? And I would fill in. And I would just open up a passage, write out a quick outline, get up and preach. And that's probably why I'm really good at this too. I don't use a script on YouTube, okay, because I put things together in my head, and I still do that. So with my ministry not going well in my first church, let a lot of key people leave. I tried to duplicate what we had done in my previous church, but I didn't have the visionary like I had, because the senior pastor of my first church in my associate days was a good visionary, and I was a good engineer. I was good at building what he envisioned. And so it worked out. It was a good partnership. But in this church, I didn't have the visionary, so I had to do it myself, and I just didn't do it really all that well. Didn't have the great ideas. I could engineer stuff, but I just wasn't good. So I went on, I resigned from my church, and then we had like 6-9 months where I just didn't have a job. And then I went into my second church in the Assemblies of God. I followed a minister who had kind of taken a lot of money from the church, pretty much illegally in my opinion. But Also, that church had very high expectations, like they were going to be the next mega church. Now the problem is they're in this small town outside of Lansing, and while if you have a good enough church, you can draw people to drive from Lansing to it. The problem with this church is they wanted a lot of stuff, but they wanted the pastor to do it all. And the problem with that is, as anybody knows in organizational leadership, if you try to get one person to run the entire organization, that's what you're going to get. And that's as far as you're going to get. I found out my capacity is about 30, 35 people if I'm doing everything myself. And so that's what ended up happening. And there was a lot of disappointment. People would, say things, do things, and it would just end up being kind of a mess. I ended up offending somebody for some strange reason, which I still don't completely understand. It was like every time I would offer up some critique about how we were doing things, they would take it very, very personally. I wasn't personally attacking anybody. I was just trying to make it better, just analyzing it to make it better. But these people were very sensitive to criticism. And that time, I'm not going to blame myself. I have had in my ministry a lot of experience with antagonists. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. So I get done with the Assemblies of God. And one of the key turning points with them was, I'm out of a job. I'm still living in the parsonage, but the salary I'm drawing is barely paying all my bills. And in the middle of all that, the Assemblies of God Michigan District Treasurer calls me up and says, "Where's your tithe?" I'm like, "Dude, I just lost my job. 10% of zero is zero." "Oh, well, I didn't know that." It's like, dude, I've been out of the ministry for 2 months. Don't you people talk about this at district office? It became a pretty clear thing that they had also shanghaied me in the back. They'd been meeting with my board without telling me. And then they also, this is the kind of church politics and denominationalism that made me want to leave it all behind. Now, as far as deconversion during all this time, I was becoming pretty disgusted with trying to, come up with a morality based on the Bible. I taught Life of Christ again, and now I had even bigger problems with the life of Jesus. But also Christian behavior after 2 years towards me and my family as a pastor in the family, I found reprehensible. It's not that people were necessarily bad, although some of them were. I mean, I had one guy straight up threaten that he was going to leave and take all his money, if I didn't do what he said. I said something to the effect of, "Don't let the door hit you in the ass on the way out." But, they always wanted me to take authoritative leadership, but they never actually wanted to give it to me. And that was true of both churches. And so it was just kind of one of those weird things where I just, didn't work. So personally, on a personal level, I'm saying, this isn't really all that it's cracked up to be. And after I left the Assemblies of God, I had a year where I was just working, really depressed about the whole thing. Read through the whole Bible trying to save my faith at that point. And what saved it was I felt that I found that the Bible could be flawed, but the message could still be good. Now, this is what you do when on a personal level you want to see your Father again, and you have so much time invested into it. You're like, man, I got to make this work, even though it's not working. And so you got to remember that this is kind of the thing that this does to your brain when you're doing these sort of things. So I spent about a year after leaving the Assemblies of God in those two churches that were a mess, between all the nonsense of Pentecostalism where they believe things are miracles when they're really not, and they think a spiritual experience is when they have an emotional outflow, which is kind of what it amounts to. When you have this outpouring of emotion and you connect it with church, it somehow becomes God. And I get that, but I don't get it anymore. But I was tired of that too. Pentecostals are very difficult to rule because they think they're all filled with the Spirit, so they have as much right to say anything as anybody else. And so pastors have a very difficult time getting anything done because everybody disputes things. So after leaving that, I ended up for a year doing nothing, and then I got into a congregational church. And the congregational church was really fit me a lot better. One, they weren't connected to any denomination. So I didn't have to deal with the denominational politics. I ended up being the pastor and essentially the head of the denomination of one church, which was cool with me because, on one hand, it's an incredible amount of power, but at the same time, I didn't have to deal with politics. I could think about things, reason through things, and say, hey, this is the best course of action. The first 4 years of that, from 2008 to 2012, went really well. I took a church of 12 people, got it up to 50-some. We had a great picnic one summer where I baptized 7 people in the river. My personal doubts about my faith kind of disappeared because it kind of felt good. I wasn't really focused on that. I was focused on running a church the way I wanted to run it. I wasn't a Pentecostal anymore, so this is a non-denominational church that's congregational and more traditional. So it was a good move for me. I could just be a Christian, okay, was what I said. I don't have to be a Christian plus. And it was good for me, and I think for 4 years I didn't really think about the issue until 2012. I hit that high water mark, and then also all of a sudden over the next year, things went downhill, and I couldn't figure it out. And then I began to start doing a little bit of an investigation for the next couple of years. And one of the things I discovered is the big person in that church, the person that actually had the most influence and control, looking back at it because of the position they held, and somebody who I considered a good friend, was discovering that they were having problems keeping control of the church the more it grew. People had different opinions than he did, and he didn't like that. When you're in a congregational church, you just have to keep control of the majority. Well, he was finding himself in the minority, and he couldn't have that. So a few well-placed rumors, a few well-placed comments. Next thing I know, I'm looking at a church of 30 all the time, which is easy to control by one person. And I'm having a fight because I'm coming up with ideas, but I'm finding that unless this person agrees with the ideas, they don't get done. If they disagree, I don't even get any traction. Which was strange because after 4 years of being very successful, you would have thought, oh, wow, we're being successful as a church. We need to let this guy handle it. But nope, can't control it. I have a lot of different opinions about this person now. At the time, I'm like, okay, we're just having a disagreement. He's still my friend and we're good. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So after that, I really had a struggle for the next 2 years, and I really struggled with my faith. And I found myself reading a lot of material by atheists and agnostics and critics of the Bible and critics of God. I read a lot of Hitchens. I read a lot of Dawkins. I read tons of the big four, Dennett, Sam Harris. I was reading other things about cosmology like Krauss and things about evolution and so on and so forth. Discovering that the other side of the aisle, the atheist side of the aisle, and the more naturalist side of the aisle had better explanations than magic and an invisible deity that I couldn't prove exist. And I was still preparing messages, and I got to a point where that was pivotal. And so I was wrestling with something. I was preaching a message on salvation, and I was wrestling with a quote by Dan Barker about sin. And that's probably what sets up my moment of deconversion. And at this point, I've hit the 23-minute mark of this video, so I'm going to call it part 1. And I'll talk about that actual day of deconversion and the aftermath that followed in the next video. In the meantime, I want to thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. And hopefully someday I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd, also known as the Rabid Atheist, signing off and wishing you a good day.